Hello. In this video, we're thinking about infectious disease, and this is for the OCR F212 course. And here are your learning outcomes to describe the causes and means of transmission of malaria, AIDS, HIV, and TB, and to discuss the global impact of malaria, AIDS, HIV, and TB. And really, this is going to be a whistle-stop tour, because actually there's not that much detail you really need to know for OCR F212. So we'll see where we go with it. Here we go. HIV/AIDS, HIV standing for human immunodeficiency virus, so I guess strictly speaking you don't talk about the HIV virus because you're repeating yourself, and AIDS stands for acquired immune deficiency syndrome. And these are some images of HIV viruses coming out of a human lymphocyte. This is in culture, and this globe here you can see on the surface, that is where a whole load more HIV particles are about to burst out. Because HIV is a disease of the immune system. The virus itself infects your T helper cells, and that being a linchpin of your immune system means that your immune system stops working, hence you get acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Its origin is maybe a little unclear because it probably happened a fair bit of time ago. HIV-1, now that's the more prevalent one, and certainly the more virulent one. It's similar in structure to SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus, which is a chimp virus, and zoonosis, i.e. it's leaping from animal to man. That probably happens about the late 19th and early 20th century, possibly via bushmeat. You eat some uncooked raw bushmeat, and if you've got bleeding gums or whatever it might be, then you're going to potentially get blood-to-blood contact there. HIV-2, that is certainly very much less common version of HIV, less virulent as well. It's still sort of confined to West Africa, and really when we talk about HIV, we normally talk about HIV-1. Transmission, as you'll probably already know, is via body fluid to blood contact. So vaginal, anal, oral sex probably less commonly so, but nonetheless it is a possibility. Direct blood contact, so a needle stick, that's when doctor, for example, when handling a hypodermic needle, which has recently been used to treat a patient with HIV, then accidentally gets that needle stuck in themselves. So that is a possible means of transmission. Transfusion, of course, there was the tragic event in the UK of haemophilia sufferers getting blood products in the late 80s, early 90s, which just weren't screened properly. And so when they got their factor 8, they received HIV in that transfusion or transmission. Screening programs these days are much more rigorous, but of course if you're looking for a means of blood-to-blood contact, then transfusion is a rather obvious one. Mother to child, it does happen via the placenta or breast milk, and that is uncommon, more common for HIV-2. And indeed, if you take antiretroviral drugs, ARVs, that lowers your viral load and reduces the chance of transmission during birth, during pregnancy, during breastfeeding. Prevention just involves stopping this contact, so using condoms, blood screening for transfusions, needle programs, that is handing out clean hypodermic needles to drug users so that drug users do not share needles. That was certainly one of the causes of the epidemic among heroin users in the UK and elsewhere. And reducing the viral load, as already mentioned. Using these ARVs, they interfere with the HIV enzyme reverse transcriptase. That means that the RNA is read of HIV and turned into DNA, and that gets incorporated into our genome. Well, ARVs inhibit that process and therefore just reduce the amount of HIV that is around, the number of HIV particles. So in particular, mother to child it'll reduce, and needle stick it'll reduce the chances of that being an effective HIV transfer mechanism. And you need to know about the global impact. Well, it is still mainly an African disease. UNAIDS in 2008 reckoned of the 33 million people with HIV. That's a big number. Don't forget that that's a big number. 70% of those live in sub-Saharan Africa. And if you just look on the table just down the right-hand side, you can see the percentage of people with the Caribbean, 1%, East Asia, less than 0.1%. Yeah, don't be too certain of all these data points because some countries don't like revealing that more of their population has HIV than they would like to let on. But you go down these, they're all under 1, and then 5.2%. That's 1 in 20. That is, look around your class, you've got 20 people, and if you've got 20 people in your class and one person has HIV, and that's the truth for every classroom in the country. So it's a big old number. What factors have led to this rise? And this is a graphical demonstration of that rise. Look at this. up and up and up and up. Maybe leveling off, who knows? That's the thought. HIV consultants these days will say, particularly in reference to the UK, that HIV is becoming less virulent, being passed on less and less. That's got to be good news if that's true. But there are a lot of factors which led to this enormous rise in the prevalence of HIV, particularly to do with bad information and bad education about it. So a simple disbelief that AIDS was due to HIV. Remember, AIDS is the symptom, if you like. It's what you see. It's the immune system going down. You don't necessarily see that it's because you've got a virus. And so there was this disbelief it was due to a virus, particularly in South Africa. And if you disbelieve that it's a virus, well, then you don't have to think about taking protective measures, such as using condoms, such as simply being careful who you sleep with, and a whole load of other things that I could go on to and probably get in trouble about. What HIV does is it's infects the T helper lymphocytes, destroys the body's immune system, therefore causing AIDS. And so also, of course, if you've got AIDS, you haven't got much of an immune system and you are more likely to get other things like malaria, which is endemic to sub-Saharan Africa, of course, and to other parts of the world, and TB, tuberculosis, because those diseases, well, if you have AIDS, the virulence of those diseases will be increased, and because there are more of them around in your body, therefore the transmission rate is increased as well. So let's go into those two. Tuberculosis, caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, a bacterium as the name suggests. And initial infection is, this is a good technical term to use, by droplet inhalation. And so you get initial infection of the respiratory tract, which is unsurprising, you'd think, because that's the first point of contact. And if you look here at these structures here, these are calcified areas of the lungs. Now, this is where TB has got into the lungs, it has infected the lung cells there, and the body hasn't quite been able to deal with it. And as such, what it tries to do instead is it tries to lock it away by calcifying the regions which have got the TB infection. And that has the effect of kind of locking away TB in your lungs. But it doesn't go away, and so therefore it can remain dormant for a very long time and then hop out and do all sorts of horrible things. It can infect your brain, bones, gut, kidneys, so it just goes into other organs and can cause organ collapse. And how is it then transmitted? Well, the host coughs up droplets, and those droplets contain bacteria, and then they are inhaled by people close to the host of the TB. Now, the infection rate itself is not as high as that for the common cold, for example, or measles, which is super, super infectious. If you sneeze and you have the flu, well, pretty much the whole room has now come into contact with that flu virus. That's not quite the same for TB, but nonetheless, of course, it is transmitted from person to person. And risk factors for that transmission are living with a sufferer, living in poorly ventilated, damp, cramped living conditions, typical of slums, refugee camps and similar. And hey, there are plenty of places in London where migrants live 10, 12 to a room in very exploitative situations, and that is a good way to transmit TB. If you are HIV positive, well, an HIV infection, because as we've discussed, because it weakens the immune system, it increases your risk of infection because you won't have the immune system around there to deal with the initial infection. And just general malnutrition and poor health. They're kind of obvious things, really, aren't they? Medical responses. The BCG vaccine, now that's not routinely given to everyone these days, to my understanding. It does offer some protection to those not previously exposed, and antibiotics thus far have seemed to be effective, but we are increasingly seeing resistant strains come through. Global impact, we have to discuss that. Killing over 1.5 million people per year, and, you know, today's story is one of Africa getting infected. And yes, we've got other areas, so we've got Russia and Southeast Asia here, but really it's Africa again, isn't it? And kind of we shouldn't be surprised by that, because if we then look onto this, we'll see for HIV prevalence in new TB cases here in sub-Saharan Africa, from Zambia here, for example, Zimbabwe, we've got more than 50% HIV prevalence in those who are getting TB for the first time. Now that, of course, is a much higher percentage than there is HIV in the general population, showing that HIV really does lead to these kind of opportunistic infections. And TB doesn't really need that much of an opportunity, so give it a great big helping hand like AIDS, and it will take root relatively easily. There is another form of TB. We just don't hear of it these days in human populations. But it's caused by Mycobacterium bovis, unsurprisingly, bovis referring to cows. It can be transmitted through cow's milk, but because of pasteurization that goes on these days, you just don't get it. Also, our herds are well kept clear of bovine TB, largely by pretty extensive culling programs in herds which have bovine TB. And you may, of course, have heard the controversy about badger culls, who thought that badgers passed TB onto cows. On to our last one. Now you'll notice that we've had infectious agents from 3 different kingdoms. We've had the first from viruses, if you indeed call that a kingdom, you probably wouldn't. The second from bacteria, more specifically eubacteria, from prokaryote. And this one is from Protoctista. It is therefore it is a pathogen. You could also call it a parasite. And we're thinking about Plasmodium. That is the genus name, and the most common species of this genus, which causes fatal malaria, is Plasmodium falciparum. That's the most virulent. And transmission, as again you'll probably be familiar with, is via the female Anopheles mosquito. Now she only bites when she is pregnant. She needs the blood meal to give her enough protein and so on and so forth to build her eggs. And so these breeding females come along and they bite, and as she bites, she injects, very cleverly, this anticoagulant from her salivary glands. She doesn't want your blood to clot as she's sucking it out. That would be really bad news for her mouth parts. So this injection comes in from her salivary glands, and here we go, Plasmodium hops in from her salivary glands into the body. This is the life cycle of malaria here. This is not something you need to have memorized for OCR biology. I put it here for completion. You can find it on Wikipedia as well. But you'll see the various stages of infection. Number 1, these sporozoites go into the human liver cell, and they will divide by mitosis in that human liver cell. Then they become merozoites as they rupture and burst out of the liver cells. And by the way, you get a spiking temperature with malaria, and that's because you have these phases where the plasmodium or the plasmodia are bursting out of cells, and suddenly you have the big amount of foreign tissue or foreign cells in your body, and so you get a spiking temperature. And then you get these merozoites, and they infect human blood cells, and they replicate in human blood cells, sometimes producing gametocytes, and then those gametocytes might be taken in by the mosquito during her blood meal, and then you complete this part of the life cycle in the mosquito herself. And then it goes round and round. Now, that makes it difficult for the body because, on the one hand, if it's hiding inside a human liver cell here, it's really difficult to have a response against that. If you raise antibodies against it, great, but they're not going to reach them if they're inside the human liver cell. And then if you've raised antibodies against this stage, and then it pops out, and then you've got this stage going on here, it's going to have different antigens on its surface. And so as a consequence, the antibodies you generate in the first place aren't going to bind onto these, and it's all very clever. It just hides away from our immune system. But also, because it's a life cycle, you can break it. So if, in particular, you can break this stage here by stopping mosquitoes biting here, then you've got a long way to really reducing the amount of malaria that is around. So mosquito nets, for example, stopping the biting using insect repellents, draining swamps so that mosquitoes have no place to breed. All these things have been tried, and particularly mosquito nets is proving pretty effective. Mosquito nets aren't particularly expensive. If you want to buy a mosquito net for a charity to send out to sub-Saharan Africa, it's not a bad thing to do by any means. It will do some good. And using anti-malarial drugs, these vary, to my understanding, as to which part of the life cycle they target, but in particular they would like to target that first stage so that they don't let the plasmodium get a foothold in your liver. Worldwide impact, again, sub-Saharan Africa, it keeps on getting hammered. Other parts of the world as well, certainly I spent quite a lot of time when I was going around South America on anti-malarials, South Asia as well. But the place where everyone really talks about malaria is sub-Saharan Africa. So, it's a pretty big deal. Some parts of the world, quarter of the children being killed by malaria, particularly if there's HIV infection going on as well, because your body is not attacking the plasmodium. So the plasmodium density in the blood increases, and so you are more likely to pass it on to a mosquito, and therefore that mosquito is more likely to pass it on to someone else. Why is there a strong tropical distribution of malaria? Well, because that is where the Anopheles mosquito lives. And so if the vector lives there, that's where the malaria is going to be. Well, thanks. That's a whistle-stop tour, and I hope that's helpful.